The alarm did not warn us. One moment the space above the Pacific Ocean was empty, and the next moment a ship the size of a small country was hanging in it, dark and silent and completely uninvited, and every sensor on the orbital platform, Perseverance, lit up at once, like the control room of a nightmare. I was 2 sips into my first coffee of the morning when it happened. My name is Yara Osei. I am a diplomat. I have spent 15 years in rooms where the wrong word ends lives, where the only currency is patience and precision, where the outcome of a conversation can save or cost hundreds of people their futures. I was not prepared for this, because nobody was prepared for this. Nobody had planned for the moment when every projection model for first contact proved wrong in the same direction. "Contact," said Faye Okonkwo from the communications station. Faye had a voice that went flat when things became serious. It was extremely flat right now. Unknown vessel. Our sensors cannot identify an origin point. It did not travel here from anywhere we can track. It simply appeared. General Marcus Webb walked from the back of the bridge to the main display without any particular urgency. Webb was a broad man with gray hair cut close, and the kind of face that had made peace with the unexpected somewhere around the age of 40. He studied the sensor data for a moment, the way a person studies a complicated problem they intend to solve. Then he said, "How large?" "Approximately 400 kilometers. Bow to stern," Faye said. "Best estimate." Nobody spoke. I did the calculation against my better judgment. 400 kilometers is roughly the length of the island of Great Britain. This ship had appeared above our planet without warning, without any approach vector, without any signal that it was coming, and it was the size of a nation. Hal Durant, our tactical officer, put the combined mass of the entire fleet on the main display. He looked at the number for about 3 seconds. Then he quietly removed it. Some numbers are better approached from the side. There were 47 ships in total, we would soon confirm. The smallest were still twice the size of any vessel humanity had ever built. Leon Grant was a young sensor analyst from Edinburgh on only his 2nd week aboard Perseverance. He sat back from his station and said, very quietly, "So that is what the end of everything looks like." "No," said General Webb, without looking away from the display. "That is what the beginning of something very hard looks like. Different thing entirely. I am not certain how many people on that bridge believed him. I am certain none of us argued. The first transmission came 9 minutes after the fleet appeared. Our translation system, built for this theoretical scenario that everyone had assumed would remain theoretical, processed the incoming signal in 11 seconds. We did not know it at the time, but that speed shocked the beings who sent the transmission. They had constructed their message, expecting it would take us weeks to decode. They had never encountered a civilization that could parse a completely foreign linguistic system in under a minute. They had built their confidence on what they expected us to be. The first crack in that confidence appeared 11 seconds after their transmission landed. The message itself was short. By authority of the Galactic Cooperative Council, the species designated human, inhabiting the planet designated Earth, was ordered to surrender all military assets, dissolve all governing bodies, and submit to administrative processing within 72 hours. Non-compliance would result in orbital sterilization. I read it twice. I read the phrase orbital sterilization a 3rd time, alone, to make sure I had understood it correctly. General Webb read it once. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and made a sound I needed a moment to identify. It was a low, brief chuckle, the specific sound a person makes when confronted with something so far outside any expectation that the mind briefly defaults to dark amusement because it cannot locate anything else. "Orbital sterilization," he said quietly. "These people have never once in 6,000 years heard the word no." Faye connected us to the global emergency network. On the secondary display, Earth's reaction was coming through in real time. Social signals, government communications, military status updates from every corner of the planet. I expected what any reasonable person would expect. I expected panic spreading across continents. collapse, populations in chaos. Some of that was present. Fear was there. I will not pretend otherwise. But it was not the loudest thing. The loudest thing, appearing in the first 20 minutes in hundreds of millions of posts across every platform, translated from 94 languages into essentially the same phrase, was a clear and almost cheerful refusal. There were jokes. There was already music appearing. There were drawings, technical analyses of alien hull design, arguments about interstellar governance law, and an extraordinary volume of creative energy directed at making the situation seem not just survivable, but fundamentally absurd. I had spent 15 years studying how human beings behave under extreme pressure. What I was watching told me something I had never been able to put into words before. Humanity's first instinctive response to a demand for submission is not terror. Fear is there, yes, doing what it always does, but the first response, the reflex that fires before the fear has finished registering, is refusal. Cheerful, automatic, almost biological refusal. Our translation system flagged an anomaly at 18 minutes past contact. It had been running passive structural analysis on the fleet's internal communication patterns and detected a sharp shift timed exactly to when the fleet's sensors were processing Earth's global reaction to the ultimatum. The behavioral model returned a single word for the detected shift: confusion. The Galactic Council, with a fleet capable of ending life on our planet, was watching humanity respond to an extinction ultimatum with jokes and music and sarcasm, and they were confused. I sent an urgent message to Secretary General Amara Diallo on the surface. Amara was from Dakar, steady and precise in the way of someone who has spent decades making difficult decisions and has stopped being surprised by how difficult they are. Her reply came back in 4 minutes. Acknowledged, hold position, convening now. The emergency session of the United Nations opened in under 2 hours. Delegates from every nation, frightened, clearly, visibly frightened in the way of people who understand exactly what they are facing. But underneath the fear was something harder and quieter that I recognized from years of working in rooms where the stakes were real. The quality of a decision already made. The session was to make it official. Consensus took 4 hours and 11 minutes. No surrender. Not conditional refusal. Not an offer to negotiate terms of compliance. An absolute, unambiguous rejection of the authority of any governing body that introduces itself to a new civilization by threatening to destroy it. The military coordination data I was reading alongside the session told the same story in a different register. Every joint defense command on the planet was active, consolidating rather than scattering. A planetary defense structure was taking shape not from a single central order, but from thousands of individual commanders across dozens of nations who had independently arrived at the same correct conclusion and were implementing it without waiting for anyone to tell them to. I drafted Earth's first diplomatic contact to the fleet. Every standard protocol I had been trained to use, and several I developed on the spot by analyzing structural patterns in their transmission. An invitation for conversation between representatives of two civilizations, with no submission implied and no authority conceded. The response came 6 hours later. One word: acknowledged. Not agreement, not acceptance, just a door left open by the width of a single word, which is all a diplomat needs. With 48 hours left on the countdown, Secretary General Diallo delivered Earth's official response. She broadcasted on every frequency we could reach. Her voice was even and clear, and every word she said had the quality of something decided rather than discussed. She said the ultimatum had been received, considered, and declined. She said Earth was not available for processing of any kind. She said that if the Council wished to speak with human representatives, those representatives were waiting. She said that if the Council intended to proceed with the action described in their transmission, they should understand that humanity had a continuous history of encountering situations that appeared impossible and had not developed the cultural instinct for stopping in response to them. Then she gave the countdown back. She told the council they had 72 hours to make their own decision. She returned their own clock. On the mandate, our passive monitoring detected another sharp communication shift. The behavioral model returned an assessment I saved immediately and did not delete. Bewilderment, high intensity, with secondary indicators consistent with early-stage apprehension. I filed my situation report from the communications room that night. Under status of negotiations, active. Under probability of human compliance, 0. Under probability that the Galactic Council had correctly assessed what they were dealing with, also 0. It was the most honest report I had ever written. Outside the viewport, the alien fleet held its position in the dark above us, enormous and patient, waiting for a species that had never once, in 100,000 years of continuous difficulty, found an impossible situation to be a convincing argument for stopping. The fleet stayed exactly where it was, and that was the first real sign that something had not gone according to their plan. Ships that arrive to collect an unconditional surrender do not hold position for 24 hours while waiting for the answer to change. They either receive the surrender or they demonstrate the cost of refusal. The fact that they were waiting and sending increasingly formal compliance requests through official channels told me their confidence had been disrupted. They had expected a sequence they knew well, and the sequence was not unfolding. I was given security clearance to observe the defense mobilization 18 hours into the standoff. What I saw changed something fundamental in my understanding of what we are as a species. I had known in the abstract that humanity had been building weapons for a very long time. I had known that armed conflict was a recurring condition of our history rather than an exception to it, but knowing those things as intellectual facts is different from standing in a coordination center in Scotland at 2 in the morning and watching every piece of that history come alive at speed. Owen Clark was running the Orbital Defense Network assembly from a converted research facility in Glasgow. He was a practical man from the engineering tradition that believes everything is in principle fixable and the only variable is how long the argument will take. When I reached him on a secure channel, he was simultaneously drinking tea from a cracked mug and arguing with 3 separate engineering teams about power distribution systems, thermal management on the high-yield emitters, and the structural limits of civilian cargo platforms being converted to long-range targeting relays. "We should not be able to do this in the time available," he told me, during a brief pause between arguments. "Academically, the physics do not support it, but the physics have been wrong about what we can accomplish before, and I have found that physics tends to be wrong in our favor when the alternative is not surviving." He went back to the argument. The team was already building a solution to a problem the argument had not yet fully defined. I watched for 20 minutes. Owen was energized in a way I had not expected to see. Not reckless, not frightened into productivity. Energized in the specific way of a person doing exactly the thing they are best at under conditions that demand everything they have. Lena Voss, a propulsion systems designer from Zurich who had been working for 41 consecutive hours when I reached her, explained it in the terms I needed. "We are a species that evolved under pressure," she said. "Not comfortable pressure, constant, genuine, life-or-death pressure, for a very long time. When you give us a problem that requires solving under those conditions, you have not put us in a bad situation. You have put us in the environment we were built for." The defense grid being assembled was improvised in ways that should not have worked, and worked anyway. It was built from existing technology, pushed far beyond its design specifications by people who understood those specifications well enough to know exactly which rules could be safely broken and which could not. It was, in some fundamental sense, exactly what humanity has always been, a collection of solutions to problems that should not have been solvable, constructed by people who did not accept that they were not solvable. Nora Hale was a propulsion physicist from Cape Town, advising the Defense Committee by satellite link from an Antarctic research station. She sent me a message that said, "The Council has no idea what it has activated. We are not working faster under pressure. We are working better. Pressure is the environment we were made for. The second signal that the Council's confidence was fracturing came through Threx. Threx was a minor species delegate from a civilization called the Vethari, attached to the Council's diplomatic observation team. He was small, perhaps a meter tall, with a body that appeared constructed from amber and fine wire, and compound eyes that caught the light in ways suggesting they processed more information than human eyes are built to handle. He was not supposed to make contact with us. He made contact anyway, 20 hours into the standoff, after we had included a data packet of human entertainment programming in a cultural broadcast attached to our diplomatic outreach messages. He sent a transmission that said, in translation, "I have been watching your moving image stories for 6 hours. I do not fully understand them, but they are the most interesting thing I have encountered in 40 years of diplomatic service. I would like to speak with you, if that is acceptable." We made it acceptable very quickly. Threx shared with us the Council's tactical assessment of Earth's defensive capability, produced 18 hours after the fleet's arrival. They had projected, based on their standard evaluation method for civilizations at our developmental stage, what their classification scale described as a Type 2.1 planetary defense grid, sufficient to deter minor interference, insufficient against a coordinated fleet action. The baseline they expected for a species our age. What their sensors were showing them at the time the assessment was produced was something their instruments classified as a Type 4.7 equivalent. A defense structure that should not exist at our developmental stage, produced in under 20 hours. The assessment's internal commentary, which Threx translated with what I read from his phrasing as barely contained delight, concluded that their initial evaluation of our technological concealment had been inaccurate, and that we had been hiding advanced capabilities for strategic purposes. They had not considered the alternative explanation, which was that we had not had this capability 20 hours earlier and had built it since, because someone told us we needed it and we had decided they were right. The probing strike came 31 hours into the standoff. 11 ships from the Council fleet in standard suppression formation, targeting a military installation in northern Chile, a demonstration of consequences, a calculated move to shatter the psychological coherence of Earth's defense response. They lost 6 ships. Staff Sergeant Danny Reyes was 23 years old and had been watching the Council ships on her sensor display for 3 hours before the strike began. She had noticed something. The shield cycling patterns were rhythmic. They operated on a predictable frequency, with a window of reduced coverage lasting approximately 0.8 seconds at the peak of each cycle. She noticed it because, as she explained in her debrief, it reminded her of a timing pattern from a combat simulation she had been playing since she was 12 years old. She briefed her team. 4 pilots executed a coordinated entry through the vulnerability window, while the remaining defense assets held the Council ships at standard range. The result was catastrophic for the Council formation, and entirely unprecedented in the Council's 6,000 years of military operational records. I relayed the engagement details to Councillor Veth in our next contact window. Veth was tall, silver-skinned, with a face that communicated information through subtle changes in membrane positioning rather than the obvious expressions I was trained to read. They were the Council's lead diplomatic representative, and I had begun to understand they were among the more thoughtful members of their delegation. When I described what Danny had done, the membrane along Veth's jaw contracted. Their secondary eyes stopped moving. "Your soldier identified a structural vulnerability in our defensive cycling." "Yes," I said. "In 3 hours." She said it reminded her of something she played as a child. A long silence. Then, "We have been using that shield cycling configuration for 900 years. No species has ever identified a vulnerability in it." "We play a great deal," I said. "We look for patterns. It is something we do from very early in life, and we do not stop." Another long silence. Then Veth said, "I would like to formally request a consultation with your Secretary General, at the earliest possible opportunity." "She will be available tomorrow," I said. The request arrived through official channels 4 hours later. Amara Diallo accepted it immediately, without showing any sign of the relief she must have felt, because not showing relief is one of the things she is best at. Inside the Council's internal communications network, visible to us through Threx's continuing and increasingly enthusiastic assistance, the fault lines were opening. Moderate factions were calling for immediate negotiation before the situation escalated further. The Dreth, a militarist species whose cultural identity was built around the concept of overwhelming decisive force, were arguing that Earth was one planet, one species, and the arithmetic of the situation was not in our favor. The math was clear. I read the Dreth position paper, which Threx passed to me with a note at the bottom in his improving English. They are wrong, aren't they? I thought about the Finnish Winter War. I thought about every moment in human history when someone had looked at the numbers and concluded the outcome was inevitable, and gotten it completely wrong. I wrote back, "Yes, they are very wrong." He replied, "I have now watched 63 hours of your entertainment content. Your species never accepts the numbers as the final answer. I found this puzzling at first. I now find it the most sensible thing I have ever observed." General Webb called me into his office on the evening of the third day. He poured 2 cups of coffee from the supply he kept locked away for circumstances he judged adequately serious, handed me one, and looked out the viewport at the fleet. "The Dreth faction will push for escalation," he said. "Days, maybe less. We need them to understand the cost before they commit." "We are one planet," I said. "We are," he said, "and they have never once in 6,000 years had to pay a cost they were not willing to pay. They have never needed to learn what that looks like when an opponent makes the cost too high. They have no experience of it at all." He said it the way he said everything, flat, certain, without performance. He had arrived at a conclusion and was describing it. I went back to my station and looked at the defense grid data. At Owen Clark, arguing with 3 engineering teams about the correct way to build something that should not exist. At Lena Voss, who had been awake for 2 days and was doing it anyway. At hundreds of thousands of people doing things nobody had trained them for, in conditions nobody had designed for. I thought about what Nora Hale had said. Pressure is the environment we were made for. I thought, they have no idea what they have walked into. The battle started at 3:41 in the morning, orbital station time. Not with a declaration, not with a countdown reaching 0. One moment, the fleet was holding its position as it had for 3 days, and the next moment, 43 ships were moving in coordinated attack formations, and every alarm on Perseverance triggered at once. I had been awake for 21 hours, reviewing diplomatic communication drafts, when the alerts fired. I reached the bridge in 45 seconds. Faye already had the formation data on every display. The approach vectors covered every orbital position, every major defense installation, every communication relay we had built. This was not a probing strike. The mandate had transmitted before the movement began, a short and formal message that said Earth's continued non-compliance had rendered negotiation non-viable and the Council was proceeding to enforcement. It was phrased with the specific confidence of an organization that had done this before and found it always worked. I picked up my translation terminal and sent back, "Enforcement against whom? We are still here." I do not know if anyone on the mandate read it in that moment. I sent it anyway. What followed was 6 hours that I have described in official reports, in personal notes, and in many conversations with people who were not there and wanted to understand what it was like. The honest answer is that no description I have written has ever fully captured it. The dominant quality was not chaos, although chaos was present. It was not terror, although terror was present. The dominant quality was human beings who are afraid, working together at the absolute edge of their capabilities, with complete and total focus. That is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever witnessed. The defense grid took an assault no engineering projection said it could survive. Our preliminary models had given it a 30% probability of holding through the first hour. The grid survived the first hour. It survived the second. It took damage, significant and structural, and in each case, within minutes, someone improvised a repair or a reconfiguration that made the grid function in a new way. Not the way it had been designed, often better. Ray Hollis was a pilot from Newcastle who had been flying defense interceptors for 11 years. When 3 of his squadron's 6 ships were destroyed in the first 20 minutes of the engagement, he reorganized the remaining 3 into a pattern no tactical manual described, identified the approach vector the Council ships were using to target the relay stations, and placed himself and his 2 remaining pilots directly in that vector as a living warning system. They stayed there for 90 minutes, evading fire, keeping the targeting backbone active until reinforcements arrived. When I asked him afterward what the experience was like, he thought about it and said, "Like the worst 30 minutes of my life," repeated 3 times. I asked, "Would you do it again?" He said, without any hesitation at all, "Yes." Gus Alderton was a ground-based defensive systems operator from Perth, with a background in systems engineering and competitive marksmanship, a combination that turned out to be more useful than anyone had anticipated. The ground platforms were facing targeting solutions the Council ships generated faster than our automated tracking was designed to handle. Gus bypassed the automated tracking and ran the platforms manually, using what he later described as feel and timing, developed over 15 years of competition. His strike rate in the after-action review was initially flagged as a data error. It was not a data error. General Marcus Webb ran the defense from the command deck of Perseverance. He was not a man who performed composure under pressure. He simply had it, in the deep and unperformable way of someone who has operated in conditions where losing composure is not an option for decades. He moved through decisions at a speed that incorporated information from dozens of sources simultaneously and produced results that the people receiving them could act on immediately. When I watched him work, the same word came to me that Owen Clark had used about his own engineering teams: not faster, better. The action that changed the direction of the battle came from Commander Aiko Tanaka. Aiko was a pilot from Osaka who had been flying for 14 years and had the kind of relationship with her aircraft that some people develop with a direct extension of their own nervous system. She flew a retrofitted cargo hauler that she had named the Spite, a choice she explained later as, "Spite is the most reliable emotion for maintaining focus when everything is going wrong." The Mandate's primary weapon array was the most dangerous single installation in the Council's fleet, responsible for the majority of the fleet's destructive capability, and it was the installation that the Council's tactical command believed no opposing pilot would approach voluntarily, because the approach corridor was covered by overlapping close defense systems with no survivable gap. Aiko found the gap, not through any calculation she had run in advance. She looked at the tactical map, identified the problem, understood that the gap was small and the timing was precise and the probability of surviving the approach was not high, and decided she was the solution to the problem. She sent one message to General Webb: "I see a way, I am going." She was already moving when she sent it. She flew the Spite into the forward arc of the primary weapon array at a speed and angle the Council's defense systems had not been calibrated to intercept, and she held it broadside across the mouth of the array like a stopper in a bottle. The close defense systems fired on her continuously for 11 minutes. The Spite's hull took damage that its original specifications would not have allowed it to survive. She kept it in position anyway. The human fleet used the gap her position created to execute the coordinated strike on the Council's formation that broke their attack coherence entirely. She survived. The array did not. The Spite came back with fractured hull plating, a disabled secondary drive, and a pilot with a broken collarbone who walked out under her own power, wearing an expression that I can only describe as satisfied. In her debrief, I asked what she had been thinking during those 11 minutes. She said, "Maintaining exact position. When the task is that precise, you cannot afford to think about anything else." I wrote in my official report, "Exceptional tactical positioning under extreme operational conditions." What I wrote in my personal notes was, she went into an impossible place because someone needed to, and she decided it would be her, and she stayed there. My own experience of the battle was less distinguished and considerably less controlled. I was on a personnel shuttle running an evacuation from a damaged section of the outer defensive ring when we took a direct hit that disabled propulsion and cracked the outer hull. We were drifting in a debris field, running on emergency life support, with a Council surveillance drone attempting to acquire a targeting lock on us. 11 people on the shuttle. Faye Okonkwo was one of them, coordinating recovery operations for 3 damaged ships simultaneously from a handheld terminal, completely calm in a way I found both reassuring and genuinely difficult to comprehend. Ensign Carlos Vidal was 22 years old, from Monterrey, less than a month aboard Perseverance. He assessed our situation in approximately 30 seconds, opened an access panel in the rear of the shuttle, and began doing something with the docking arm assembly that did not appear in any manual I had ever seen. 4 minutes later, he had constructed a device that produced directional thrust using components not designed for that purpose and physics I remain uncertain about. He used it to push us out of the surveillance drone's targeting window and into the debris shadow of a destroyed Council ship, where we held position for 38 minutes until a recovery team reached us. I asked him afterward how he had calculated the trajectory needed to put us in exactly the right position. He gave me a slightly puzzled look and said, "I did not calculate it. I could feel where we needed to go, and I got us there." I wrote in my official report, "Intuitive spatial reasoning under severe operational stress." It was the most accurate description I could manage for something that may not have a technical description. At the 4-hour mark, the Council formation began to break. They had taken losses they had not projected. Their command coherence had been disrupted in ways their planning had not anticipated needing to address. 3 ships in the outer formation broke off their assigned positions without orders and moved to increased standoff distance. 2 others made contact during a coordination failure and disabled each other. The mandate's own communication patterns, which our translation system had been analyzing continuously, showed a rapid escalation in volume and urgency that was exactly the signature of a command structure that had stopped being certain it understood what was happening. The Dreth flagship, a ship we had identified from communication signatures as the Iron Covenant, pulled back from its attack vector and moved to a holding position. 4 hours earlier, the mandate had been broadcasting demands for our unconditional surrender. Now the Iron Covenant was broadcasting a request for immediate ceasefire and a return to negotiations. General Webb reviewed the ceasefire request. He read it once. Then he drafted his response. Earth would accept a ceasefire when the Council's fleet had withdrawn to a position beyond the orbit of the Moon. The fleet withdrew to beyond the orbit of the Moon. The cost of the battle was specific and real, and I will not reduce it to abstraction. 214 human beings were gone. 11 ships were destroyed. The Carmen Line station was debris. 3 cities had structural damage from re-entering wreckage. We held the memorial before the ceasefire was formally signed, not after. The Secretary General read each name. It took 47 minutes. Every installation with communication capability carried the broadcast. On the far side of the Moon, the Council's fleet could hear it if they chose to listen. Threx watched the broadcast from his section of the mandate. He sent me a message during the reading. It said, "You are mourning them while the conflict is still technically active." "Yes," I replied. "Most species wait until they have won," he said. "They believe grief weakens them during an active engagement." "We disagree," I said. "They deserve to be grieved, and they deserve to be part of the victory. We do not separate those things." He was quiet for a long time. Then, I surrendered when my species was first contacted by the Council. We all did. I believed it was the only rational response to something larger than ourselves. I am reconsidering many things. I saved that message. I have not deleted it. Through the viewport of Perseverance, Earth turned below me, slow and blue and whole. From orbital altitude, you cannot see the damage to the 3 cities. You cannot see the debris fields. You can only see the planet, complete, doing what it has always done. We had not won a war. We had won a battle at real cost against an opponent with superior equipment, greater resources, and thousands of years of military experience we did not have. We had won it by being exactly what we have always been, a species that, when struck, responds with focused and competent refusal to stop. Not out of rage, not out of desperation, with the calm attention of people who have been solving survival problems for their entire existence and have gotten very good at it. I filed my after-action report. Under result, ceasefire achieved. Under assessment, the Council's expectation of a rapid resolution has been substantially and permanently revised. Under recommendation, hold every position, pursue diplomatic contact through every available channel, and do not allow the Council fleet to reform without full awareness of what they are doing. Under other notes, I wrote, we should not have been able to hold that grid. We should not have been able to break their formation. The fact that we did both is not a miracle. It is what happens when you ask a species that has been surviving impossible situations for 100,000 years to please survive one more. The news of the Carmen Line battle spread through the Council's communication network faster than any transmission we could track. Threx reported this to us 6 hours after the ceasefire. He said, I want you to understand what is happening in the Council's territory right now. There has not been a new contact species that resisted successfully in 6,000 years. Not once. 209 species surrendered at first contact. 3 resisted briefly and were concluded within weeks. And now the entire network is watching a species that fought and is still there. He sent a second message immediately after. I believe this is either the most important thing that has happened in 6,000 years or the beginning of something that goes very badly for everyone. I am not yet certain which. I showed both messages to Amara Diallo. She read them and said, without expression, it can be both. Keep talking to him. The Council's administered species network was watching with an intensity the Council had not anticipated needing to manage. 209 civilizations, each of which had made the rational calculation the Council expected of them, were now observing a species that had made a different calculation. Threx introduced me, through a carefully secured channel, to a coalition of delegates from 12 subject species who had been meeting informally for several years. They called themselves, in translation, the Observers of the Long Wait. They were not a resistance movement. Until this week, they had not believed resistance was a real category. They had been watching for something they could not have named. Now they could name it. Shara spoke most during our first contact session. She was from a species called the Omhari, dark-eyed and precise, with a quality of choosing every word before speaking it that I recognized immediately. She had been part of the Council's administrative system for 30 years. I need you to understand what is at stake for us, she said. Not for you, for every species watching this. If you fail, the Council will redesign their first contact protocols. They will close the channels between subject species and new contacts. And everyone who has been watching this week will spend the rest of their existence knowing that resistance was possible, that it happened once, and that it failed, and that nothing changed. What if we do not fail? I said. Shara was quiet. Then, we have no framework for that. We have only ever existed inside the framework the Council built, but we would like to find out what is outside it. Then we will try to show you, I said. The Deep Fleet arrived 4 days after the ceasefire. They had been held in a staging position closer than we had known, which told us the Council had been more prepared for possible resistance than their initial confidence suggested. 300 ships. We detected them crossing the outer boundary of our solar system. Admiral Clive Marsh sent me a message from the Orbital Defense Command. It said, I need you to look at these sensor readings and tell me you still believe the diplomatic track is viable. I looked at the readings. 300 ships, each larger than anything in the initial fleet. Against 47, we had built something that held and fought to a ceasefire. 300 was not 47. I sent back. The diplomatic track is the only track that ends with both sides still existing. Keep sending me the sensor data. He sent the data every 4 hours after that, without further commentary on viability. The Deep Fleet's transmission arrived 48 hours after their appearance. It was short and formal. It said this conflict was concluded and that Earth's final opportunity for survival required immediate and unconditional surrender and acceptance of administrative custody within the Council's governance framework. Administrative custody. I had learned, from files that Threx had passed to us at significant risk to himself, what administrative custody meant. Controlled survival. Continued existence within parameters defined entirely by the Council. Culture, development, and reproduction managed according to what the Council determined was appropriate for a compliant member of the galactic community, existing as a managed thing rather than a living civilization. I brought the files to Diallo and Webb. Diallo read them in silence. When she finished, she said, "How many species are currently in this condition?" 163, I said. A long quiet. Then, none of them were given a choice. No, I said. She stood, straightened her jacket, said, "Then we are going to change that." The response she delivered to the Deep Fleet was broadcast on every frequency we could reach, including channels that would carry it across the Council's entire administered territory. She spoke for 11 minutes. She spoke about what humanity had survived: ice ages, plagues, wars we had conducted against ourselves, coming close more than once to ending our own civilization, and recovering anyway, and building again from the pieces. She spoke about the specific quality of human persistence that is not stubbornness, but something more structural, something built at a level below rational decision-making and cultural choice. She said, "You are counting ships. We understand the mathematics and we are not persuaded by them, because mathematics is not the only variable in this equation. You have 300 ships above us, and we have 8 billion people who have never once in the entire recorded history of our species agreed that any situation was truly over. That is not a military claim. It is a description of what we are. You can do the arithmetic, or you can speak to us as equals, but we will be here either way. We will be here long after the reason for this conflict has been forgotten by everyone involved except us. That is not a threat. That is simply what you have encountered." The Deep Fleet did not fire. 300 ships, holding position at the edge of our solar system, not firing. Threx sent a message. It said, "Shara from the Omhari has broadcast your Secretary General's speech to every available channel in the Observer Network. It has been received by representatives from at least 60 species. Several of them are experiencing what I believe is the equivalent of what your species calls crying. I may also be experiencing something equivalent. Our species does not cry in quite the same way, but I think that is what is happening." I sent back, "Tell them it is not over yet." He sent back, "They know. That is exactly why." The communication pattern shifts from the Deep Fleet were unlike anything we had seen from the Council's forces before. The translation system's behavioral model processed them and flagged them as an outlier. No comparable pattern existed in the Council's 6,000 years of recorded communication data. The closest analogy the system could find came from human behavioral data, and the word it returned was uncertainty. The deep structural kind, experienced by an entity that has for the first time encountered a situation it cannot predict. Inside the Council, the fractures became public. 7 species formally abstained from further offensive action and called for an emergency governance session to review the first contact protocols. 2 species, the Vethari and a civilization called the Moran, went further and broadcast direct messages to Earth expressing support for our position. They were suspended from the Council that same day. Threx received his suspension notice while we were on a communication channel. He read it, set it aside, and said in his now fluent English, "That is acceptable. I was not enjoying membership very much." "Are you all right?" I asked. "I am doing an equivalent of crying," he said, "but I am very much all right. I have been afraid of the wrong things for quite a long time, and it is uncomfortable to discover that, but it is better to discover it than to continue." The Deep Fleet held its position. It did not advance. It did not fire. I filed my assessment. Under probability of Council initiating full offensive action, substantially reduced. Under reason, they are learning what uncertainty feels like. It is visible in their communication patterns, in the breakdown of their factional unity, in the fact that 300 ships are sitting at the edge of our solar system and not moving forward. Under other notes, the Galactic Council has conducted military operations for 6,000 years without encountering a situation it could not conclude on its own terms. They have no experience of uncertainty at this scale. They do not know how to hold an uncertain outcome in their minds and continue functioning. We have been doing nothing else for our entire history. The request for talks came from Counselor Veth directly, bypassing every formal channel, through the private emergency contact code I had given them in our very first conversation. The message was 2 sentences. "We were wrong about your species. We would like to discuss what comes next." I read it 4 times. Then I printed it on paper, because some things are worth having in a form that does not disappear when the power fails. I brought it to Diallo and Webb. We met in the small conference room on Perseverance that had become the informal center of human decision-making over the past week. Webb had coffee. Diallo had water. I had forgotten to bring anything and did not go back for it. Diallo read the message, said, "Where do they want to meet?" "Neutral space," I said. "A Vethari station, outside our solar system. Threx's people have offered it." "The suspended Vethari," Webb said. "Yes." "Good," he said. "I trust suspended parties. They have demonstrated their judgment." Diallo's conditions for attending were not offered as conditions. They were stated as facts. The meeting would be between representatives of 2 sovereign civilizations, with no implied concession of authority from either side. We would use our own translation system, which was by that point as accurate as the Council's. The fact that we had constructed a translation system of that quality in 6 weeks from scratch was something the Council had not fully processed. Their reaction when they encountered it across the table would be worth observing. Before we left for the Vethari station, Earth had the most important conversation in our species' history. It happened in a Geneva conference room with bad lighting and not enough chairs and coffee that had been sitting in the pot for too long. The World Defense Council had to decide what we were asking for. The arguments were genuine and not simple. Some delegates argued for a protected expansion zone, a guaranteed area of the galaxy where no Council authority could reach. Some argued for immediate and comprehensive technology exchange. Some argued for reparations for the damage done to our infrastructure and for the lives lost in the battle. Some argued for something larger, the liberation of every species currently living under the Council's administrative custody, freedom for every civilization that had surrendered at first contact without being given a real choice. All of those were legitimate positions. I listened to all of them. I did not speak until Diallo asked me directly what I thought should anchor our position. I said, "Any of those outcomes are achievable, and most of them are achievable simultaneously. But the most important thing we can ask for is the thing that changes what happens to the next civilization the Council encounters. The thing that means the next species that meets them gets an introduction instead of an ultimatum." Petra Lang was a delegate from Berlin who had spent 30 years in international humanitarian law and had the kind of analytical precision that cuts through argument to its actual structure. She said, "You want to change the charter?" "One clause," I said. "First contact is an introduction, not an acquisition." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That changes everything downstream, every contact that comes after. Every species that has not yet been found." "Yes," I said, "that is the point." The vote was decisive. Earth's negotiating position, full and permanent sovereignty, unconditional and unalterable, diplomatic relationship on equal terms, open and mutual technology exchange, and the clause, the single clause that would need to be in the Galactic Charter as a non-negotiable condition of any ongoing relationship between Earth and the Council. No species, ever again, introduced to the galactic community through a threat. The Vethari station was small by galactic standards, built for diplomatic observation rather than ceremony, which suited me. I did not want ceremony. I wanted a functional conversation between parties who had recently been trying to destroy each other and now needed to work out how to share a galaxy. Threx met us at the docking port. In person, he was smaller than the communication displays had suggested, and more delicate, and more vivid. His compound eyes caught the light in ways that made it apparent they were built to process more than human eyes handle. He greeted me in English. Not translated English, genuine, fluent, carefully spoken English, which he had been learning in secret since the day we sent him the entertainment data packet. He said, "You look tired." "I am tired," I said. "Are you all right after the suspension?" He waved a delicate appendage. "I was not enjoying membership very much," he said. "I am very much enjoying this." 62 representatives from subject species were in the observation gallery when the formal session opened. They had come from across the Council's administered territory, many of them at personal risk, to watch what happened in this room. Shara from the Omhari was there. She was larger in person than the communication displays had shown, and her eyes, which were dark and very steady, found me the moment I walked in. She gave the gesture that Threx had told me combined acknowledgement and hope in the Omhari language. I returned it, as closely as I could approximate. Councillor Veth was already seated when I entered. They looked different from our early communications. Something in the way they held themselves had changed. The careful authority was still present. The absolute quality of it was not. "Thank you for coming," Veth said. "Thank you for asking," I said. A pause. Then, "Your species is more difficult than anything the Council has previously encountered." "We know," I said. "We are generally aware of this about ourselves." Something shifted in Veth's expression. I would call it recognition, the kind that occurs when something unexpected turns out to be entirely consistent. I placed a document on the table between us. Not a diplomatic document, a historical record. The files Threx had given me, formatted and translated by our own system, with 2 names at the top of the first page. "Before we discuss any terms," I said, "we need to speak about these 2 names." Veth looked at the document. The facial membrane along their jaw contracted. "Those resolutions were conducted under Council authority according to established protocols that—" "I know what authority they were conducted under," I said. "I am not here to debate authority. I am here to tell you that these 2 names are going into the official primary transcript of this meeting. That is not a negotiable position. It is a condition of this conversation continuing." Veth was quiet for a very long time. At the far end of the table, the Dreth commander's skin pigmentation went deeply dark, the signal of intense agitation. The Dreth representative said that including such material in an official diplomatic record mischaracterized historical council operations and was not acceptable under any recognized negotiating framework. I said, "Then we have reached the limit of what is achievable today." I closed my documents and prepared to stand. The Dreth delegation left the room. They returned 9 hours later, because the alternative to returning was a war they now understood they could not conclude quickly, and the Dreth were, underneath everything, administrators, and administrators are not functional without a completed record. When Commander Reth returned, they said, "The names can appear in the supplementary annexure to the official record." I said, "They will appear in the primary record, or we are not signing anything today or any other day." 3 hours of argument. The names went in the primary record. I will not pretend that was justice. It was not justice. Nothing that can be done now is justice for 2 civilizations that no longer exist. But it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is where every act of justice that is still possible must begin. Someone who knew those civilizations existed is now required to say so, permanently, in an official record. That matters. That will always matter, even when it is not enough. The rest of the negotiation took 11 hours across 2 days, with 4 moments when the Dreth delegation walked out and returned. One incident in which a Dreth representative threw what our translation system rendered as a procedural administrative implement across the room, which Threx, sitting nearby, picked up and examined with what I interpreted as genuine scientific interest, and one moment near the end of the second day, when Veth said, after 7 consecutive hours of work, "Your species does not stop." "We are aware of this, yes," I said. "I am beginning to find it admirable," Veth said. "We find it inconvenient ourselves sometimes," I said. The Interstellar Accord was signed on the morning of the second day. Earth's sovereignty, absolute, permanent, unalterable. Our space, our government, our development, our decisions, entirely and forever our own. Technology exchange, open and mutual, governed by a joint oversight council with equal representation from both sides. Diplomatic relationship, formal, ongoing, between civilizations of equal standing. And Amendment 1 of the revised Galactic Charter, all first contact events shall be governed by the principle of mutual introduction. No species may be compelled to join, submit to, or be administered by the Council without freely given and fully informed consent. Sovereignty is the default. Membership is the invitation. The ratification vote within the Council took 8 days. It passed. It passed because 60 subject species sent their own observers to the vote. It passed because Shara from the Omhari had been transmitting the proposed amendment to every available channel since the day after the battle, and 60 civilizations that had surrendered without resistance at first contact had read it and understood what it meant for every civilization not yet found. After the signing, I stood at a viewport in the Vethari station and watched the Deep Fleet begin its long withdrawal from our solar system. 300 ships, moving out slowly, at the speed of a decision finally made. Threx stood beside me. He was eating from a small container, translucent cubes that caught the light. He offered me one. It tasted like static electricity and dried apricot. I ate it, because under the circumstances, trying new things seemed like the correct response to the weak. "Do you know what they are calling your species now?" he said. "In the Council's networks, in the subject species channels. The name that appeared, and that everyone kept using. Something unflattering," I said. "The unmovable," he said. "In my language, it carries more than one sense. A mountain that is simultaneously somehow moving toward you. Something rooted to its ground that is also advancing. Both things present in the same word at the same time." I thought about that. I thought about 214 names that had taken 47 minutes to read. About Aiko Tanaka in the mouth of an alien weapon array, holding the spite in position while it absorbed damage it should not have survived. About Carlos Vidal building impossible thrust out of docking hardware by feeling where the ship needed to go. About Danny Reyes identifying a 900-year-old pattern in 3 hours because it reminded her of a game she had played since childhood. About Owen Clark arguing with 3 engineering teams simultaneously about the correct way to build something that should not exist. About Gus Alderton running targeting platforms manually by feel. About Ray Hollis reorganizing a broken formation into something no manual described. About Lena Voss working for 2 days without stopping because pressure was the environment she was built for. About General Webb looking at 300 ships and saying, quietly and without performance, that the cost of finishing it would be more than they were willing to pay. Not as a claim designed to reassure anyone, as a conclusion he had reached through analysis and was stating plainly. "What happens now?" Threx asked. I thought about 8 billion people, about 60 civilizations watching this week with new eyes. About every species not yet found that would now receive an introduction instead of an ultimatum. About every question this week had answered and every question it had opened. "Now," I said, "we make a mess of the galaxy, very enthusiastically, and hopefully in a way that is useful to most of the people in it." Threx made the sound his species makes when something has landed correctly. It sounds like rain on a window you cannot see. I went to the communication room to file my final report. Outside, the withdrawal fleet was still moving. Inside, somewhere on the station, Shara was transmitting the full text of Amendment 1 to every subject species in the Council's administered territory, and 60 civilizations that had surrendered without resistance at first contact were reading it for the first time and understanding, for the first time, that the answer to an entity that says you must comply can simply be no, and that no, spoken clearly enough and held long enough, backed by enough stubborn and competent and creative and completely human effort, can change the rules that every other civilization in the galaxy has to live by. I wrote my final report. Under mission outcome, successful. Under notes, we were afraid. Every human being who lived through this week was genuinely and specifically afraid. We understood what was pointed at us. We did not minimize it or misread it or decide it was smaller than it was. We were afraid in the precise way of people who have accurately assessed what they are facing, and we refused anyway. Not because we were certain we would win. We were not certain. Not because we had calculated that the odds favored us. The odds did not favor us. We refused because we are a species that has been in an impossible situation before. We have been in an impossible situation, in various forms and at various scales, for as long as we have existed, and at some point in the long history of being human, we made a decision, not a formal one, not a conscious one, but a decision built into our biology and our stories and the specific way we pass what we know to each other across generations, that impossible situations were not a reason to stop. They were just the conditions in which the work happened. The Galactic Council demanded humanity surrender. Earth laughed. Then Earth got to work. That is always the order of things. That is always how it goes. That is, in the end, just what we are.